Americans now have the highest credit card debt in history. Translation: you didn't learn anything!
Debt is an invisible burden being carried by the country's most vulnerable.
Stanford professor Scott Sagan once said something everyone who follows the economy or investment markets should hang on their wall. Things that have never happened before happen all the time. History is mostly the study of surprising events, but it is often used by investors and economists as an unassailable guide to the future. Do you see the irony? Do you see the problem? It is smart to have a deep appreciation for economic and investing history. History helps us calibrate our expectations, study where people tend to go wrong, and offers a rough guide of what tends to work. But it is not in any way a map of the future. A trap many investors fall into is what I call historians as prophets fallacy, and over-relying on past data as a signal to future conditions in a field where innovation and change are the lifeblood of progress. You can't blame investors for doing this.
That's hilarious.
If you view investing as a hard science, history should be a perfect guide to the future. Geologists can look at 1 billion years of historical data and form models of how the Earth behaves. So can meteorologists and doctors. Kidneys operate the same way in 2020 as they did in 1020. But investing is not a hard science. It's a massive group of people making imperfect decisions with limited information about things that will have a massive impact on their well-being, which can make even smart people nervous, greedy, and paranoid. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, once said, "Imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons had feelings." Well, investors have feelings, quite a few of them.
But there's another ultra-important component here. Call it the emotional side of the equation.
You don't need a lot of brains in this business. I mean, I've always said if you got an IQ of 160, give away 30 points to somebody else because you don't need it in investments. What you do need is emotional stability.
That's why it's hard to predict what they'll do next based solely on what they did in the past. The cornerstone of economics is that things change over time, because the invisible hand hates anything staying too good or too bad indefinitely.
These hands will bring you great fame.
Investor Bill Boner once described how Mr. Market works. He's got a capitalist at work t-shirt on and a sledgehammer in his hand. Few things stay the same for very long, which means we can't treat historians as prophets. The most important driver of anything tied to money is the stories people tell themselves and the preferences they have for goods and services.
Nobody, I don't care if you're Warren Buffett or if you're Jimmy Buffett, nobody knows if the stock is going to go up, down, sideways.
Those things don't tend to sit still. They change with culture and generation. They're always changing and always will. The mental trick we play on ourselves here is an over-admiration of people who have been there, done that when it comes to money. Experiencing specific events does not necessarily qualify you to know what will happen next. In fact, it really does, because experience leads to an overconfidence more than forecasting ability.
$1 more. Why not?
Boom!
Two dangerous things happen when you rely too heavily on investment history as a guide to what's going to happen next. 1. You'll likely miss the outlier events that move the needle the most. The most important events in historical data are the big outliers, the record-breaking events. They are what move the needle in the economy and the stock market. The Great Depression, World War II,
A state of war.
the dot-com bubble,
and that's what these traders are.
September 11th.
A huge explosion now.
The housing crash of the mid-2000s. A handful of outlier events play an enormous role because they influence so many unrelated events in their wake. 15 billion people were born in the 19th and 20th centuries. But try to imagine how different the global economy and the whole world would be today if just 7 of them never existed. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Gavrilo Princip, Thomas Edison, Bill Gates, Martin Luther King. I'm not even sure that's the most meaningful list, but almost everything about the world today, from borders to technology to social norms, would be different if these 7 people hadn't left their mark. Another way to put this is that 0.00000000004% of people were responsible for perhaps the majority of the world's direction over the last century. The same goes for projects, innovations, and events. Imagine the last century without World War II, the Manhattan Project, vaccines,
The polio vaccine can begin to protect American
antibiotics,
Before they invaded the body.
ARPANET,
The telephone is connected to the telephone network.
September 11th,
We better get out of the way.
the fall of the Soviet Union. How many projects and events occurred in the 20th century? Billions? Trillions? Who knows? But those 8 alone impacted the world orders upon orders of magnitude more than others. The thing that makes tail events easy to underappreciate is how easy it is to underestimate how things compound. How, for example, 9/11 prompted the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, which helped drive the housing bubble, which led to the financial crisis, which led to poor job market, which led tens of millions to seek a college education, which led to $1.6 trillion in student loans with a 10.8% default rate. It's not that intuitive to link 19 hijackers to the current weight of student loans, but that's what happens in a world driven by a few outlier tail events. The majority of what's happening at any given moment in the global economy can be tied back to a handful of past events that were nearly impossible to predict.
One thing that we can be quite certain of is that any predictions we make today for what the future will be like in 50 years will be wrong.
The most common plot of economic history is the role of surprises. The reason surprises occur is not because our models are wrong or our intelligence is low. It's because the odds that Adolf Hitler's parents argued on the evening 9 months before he was born were the same as them conceiving a child. Technology is hard to predict because Bill Gates may have died from polio if Jonas Salk got cranky and gave up on his quest to find a vaccine. The reason we couldn't predict the student loan growth is because an airport security guard may have confiscated a hijacker's knife on 9/11. That's all there is to it. The problem is that we often use events like the Great Depression and World War II to guide our views of things like worst-case scenarios when thinking about future investment returns. But those record-setting events had no precedent when they would occur. So the forecaster who assumes the worst and best events of the past will match the worst and best events of the future is not following history. They're accidentally assuming that the history of unprecedented events doesn't apply to the future. The most important economic events of the future, things that will move the needle the most, are things that history gives us little to no guide about. They will be unprecedented events. Their unprecedented nature means we will not be prepared for them, which is part of what makes them so impactful. This is true for both scary events like recession and wars, and great events like innovation.